Hello. Thanks very much for having me, and thanks really again to James and Danny and everybody who's been involved in bringing IST to Canada. As a Canadian increasingly involved in the transitions community and others, it's been really thrilling to see this kind of surge of North American interest in this scholarship, and I think there's a lot of promise. We sometimes feel behind the times here in Canada. I feel like there's so much excellent work that we need to learn from and gather and marshal. So this is a really excellent step in that direction, and I'm thrilled to be here. So this is an experiment on how to actually adhere to a title that has alliteration in it and have these words actually make sense in the context of a talk. So I'm hoping to speak today about a really exciting domain of research and practice that I think is sort of poorly understood, but offers a lot of potential for accelerating sustainability transitions in Canada and around the world. And that is this poorly understood set of actors, small businesses. So that's going to be the focus of my talk today. Okay, so with this crowd, with these people in the room, I surely don't need to make the case for the necessity of something more than incremental change, something more than tinkering around the edges. We've heard it again and again in our keynotes and our panel presentations and our dialogues all week long, that change is afoot. Dramatic change of one kind or another, as John Robinson highlighted yesterday. There have been efforts accumulating to kind of quantify, to illustrate the scale of this change, ranging from the planetary boundaries framework, of course, which most of you are very familiar with, kind of looking at a planetary scale and identifying these 9 systems that are responsible for the planet being a habitable place for us, for our civilization as we know it, and trying to quantify, are there thresholds in these systems that we don't want to push ourselves over lest we enter this new territory of dramatic uncertainty, of sort of ripple effects at the planetary scale. So the planetary boundaries framework really articulating that, the idea of the Anthropocene, coming up with 24 indicators, this dashboard of human impact on the planet, ranging from, of course, exponentially increasing economic activity, but also water consumption, telecommunications, I mean, you name it, and the curve is like this for the last 50 years. So this is the place we find ourselves in, a time of great change, a time of rapid change, and the implications of human activities are not something that we will experience in the distant future, but of course are becoming manifest today, as evidenced by the recent report on biodiversity and ecosystem services, the 1.5 degree report that we heard about earlier. So the change is happening now. This suggests that we need to be creative, be careful, be innovative in trying to figure out where solutions might come from. And by solutions to sustainability challenges, I mean not just these incremental changes, but what can actually transform development pathways towards more sustainable ones. And when I say transformation, I mean a fundamental, a deep, non-linear shift in the way that our cities, that our systems of consumption and production actually work, the values that they're rooted in. So this is a really deep shift that we're looking for. So we have to look everywhere, I think, for these solutions that are transformative. Otherwise, we're going to miss real, I think, powerful potential, niche innovations that actually may challenge and destabilize the incumbent regime. So I have an interdisciplinary background. I'm sort of a political scientist. I'm sort of a human geographer, as my students know to their anguish. And in political science, when we have been talking about these grand challenges, environmental issues, climate change, sustainability, et cetera, for the longest time, these were considered global challenges in need of global solutions, and the only actors that had agency at the global scale were states. right? So there was a lot of work on state-to-state negotiations, global treaties and such. Increasingly over the last 10 or 15 years, of course, the push has been towards recognizing how important, in the sort of political science language, non-state actors are. So what role do civil society organizations play? What role do private sector organizations play? And so that has been gaining steam, but where private sector actors are really engaged in conversations around environmental governance, the focus has largely been on large transnational corporations. For obvious reasons, they have a ton of power, they're huge emitters, one Walmart can have the emissions of a medium-sized country. So if they make a decision to pursue a more sustainable development pathway, that can have huge impacts. But the reality is that most of our economy, most of the private sector is not made up of small businesses or large businesses at all. It's actually made up of small businesses. But there's just so many of them, thousands and thousands and thousands. So it's difficult to collectively talk about what potential they might hold in the space of sustainability transformations. So it's this gap in our understanding of how we might accelerate transformations that our work addresses. So I'm going to try to build an argument for why we need to kind of methodically and creatively engage with small businesses on sustainability transformations and transitions. I work mostly in urban spaces. I consider myself sort of an urban sustainability governance scholar with a small business focus. So we could argue that small businesses should be absolved of responsibility for responding to climate change, and sustainability more broadly. And there might be a couple of reasons to argue for their absolution. One is that they just don't have agency. One is that they're actually not really responsible for much in the way of emissions or impact. And the other is perhaps that they don't have much in the way of transformative potential. And I'll kind of give you sort of some details on all of those. So do they have agency? Well, I mean, some have argued that, and not Stefan Schaltiger, I'll get to him in a sec, that small businesses are kind of locked into supply chains. Their activities are really predetermined by larger firms, that they're kind of bound to these materialities or the sort of path-dependent infrastructures of cities. They actually don't have much in the way of agency. Stefan Schaltiger and others would argue actually that sustainability entrepreneurs have quite a bit of potential to even transform mass markets. I'll get to where our research sort of comes out on that. We have some mixed evidence in that regard. But we do know, we have a lot of evidence that small businesses are quite agile. They are unencumbered by really complex organizational structures that larger firms might be. And there's a really close connection between the values of the owner and the manager and the operation of the business. So the person who owns and manages the SME can make a decision and really change quite quickly the operations of that firm. That is not the case in larger firms. So there is actually some powerful agency, I think, that small businesses demonstrate. Do they have responsibility? Well, a social enterprise called Climate Smart, which, disclaimer, I worked for a little while after my PhD a decade ago, has tried to assess what portion of Canadian greenhouse gas emissions are under the direct control of small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, and they've found that collectively, small and medium-sized enterprises are responsible for about 200 million tons of greenhouse gases a year, more than the combined total from our annual transportation emissions, and more than the combined annual emissions of Quebec, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the Atlantic provinces combined. And that's what's under their direct control. So for those of you who think in greenhouse gas inventories, that's like a scope 1, scope 2 kind of direct control. So clearly they have responsibility. So they can't be absolved. Small businesses can't be absolved in that regard. Do they have transformative potential? That is a more complex question, most certainly. And I'd like to draw your attention to this is sort of the newer terrain, right? What does it take for a small business actually to transform its operations and even its deeper reason for being, its business model, to pursue sustainability transitions. So I have a cluster of awesome colleagues and folks sitting sort of over here. But Chris Luderitz, who is part of my lab at the University of Waterloo, Linda Westman, Scott Morton, Mia, Jose Di Bella, Alexander Mercado, are all part of our team who are looking into this issue of transformative potential. And we would argue, I think, that that small businesses do have the potential to undertake these transformative sustainability experiments in a couple of ways. One is that we have evidence from a large sample size survey, which I'll get to in a second, and a ton of interviews, that interventions are taking place that not only target kind of the internal efficiency-oriented optimization sort of stuff internal to the business, but also question the deeper business model and have the potential to ripple out, shifting urban culture, shifting social practice, shifting consumer demand. So there is ripples out beyond the small business that does indeed have transformative potential. And we're seeing really interesting dynamics in some sectors of the small business community, which I think also has transformative potential, where businesses in the same sector are kind of banding together and are not in competition with one another, but rather want to collaborate and view their competitors as their unsustainable counterparts. So that actually challenges the sort of underlying notion of capitalism, really, this competition amongst all firms. So that collaboration is becoming really powerful. So perhaps small businesses have agency, they have responsibility, and they have some transformative potential, but have they actually abdicated themselves? Have they stepped down from taking responsibility for their own impact on climate change and sustainability more broadly? So we carried out a large sample size survey. To our knowledge, I think the largest survey of small businesses and sustainability in this space in Toronto and Vancouver, about 1,700 of them. And we tried to get at small businesses that are not the sustainability forerunners. So we kind of left that language to like the middle of the survey to try and get in as many normal businesses as we could, and then ask them about sustainability and what might motivate them. So we had a pretty good range of small businesses participating, and they indicated overwhelmingly that they believe sustainability is important. Their reasons for considering sustainability, for making progress on it, were a little bit different than what we expected. Small businesses are usually kind of caricatured as conservative, as reactive, and as these rational, calculators of costs and benefits. It turns out like none of us are rational cost-benefit calculators or utility maximizers. I don't know. It's shocking, I know. And small businesses in particular are not as well. The number one motivator or perceived benefit for them was actually community reputation. So that they saw this sustainability as a really important way that they can contribute to their community, distinguish themselves, align their values with the operations of their business, and yes, save costs. That is number two. Of course, it's crucial. The profit margins in small businesses can be very fine. But these motivators illustrated to us that we need to start thinking more carefully about small businesses, not as these purely rational economic actors, but of course as social actors and political actors themselves in the governance of sustainability and climate change. But of course, motivation is distant from action. So if thinking something is important, arguing that there might be perceived benefits is a far cry from taking steps, and even farther cry from this radical transformative action that we might be looking for, not the incremental stuff. So I would say the picture here is mixed. Some of them, many SMEs, if we're being realistic, if we're trying to really wrap our heads around the state of things, have indeed abdicated some of their responsibility on sustainability. Why is that? We're finding, of course, that they're strapped for time, that they're strapped for technical advice and human resources. These are small firms without a dedicated person trying to advance sustainability. They don't have a coordinated voice to lobby government actors, certainly, or the sort of economic sway. They may not sense overwhelming demand from up or down their supply chain, so they're not really sure what they're responding to, and they don't sense this overwhelming regulatory signal that's pushing them. So those are some of our explanations for why we see this picture. Nonetheless, with that being said, if we look around our communities, we do in fact see an incredible abundance. And this is where we tend to locate ourselves in our work. An abundance of deeply creative innovation on sustainability, not just technical innovation, but social innovation as well, that almost being more important, not just incremental, but radical. So we can look across Canada and around the world and find thousands of examples, really. Just a few here that we've encountered and worked with in various capacities, ranging from Victoria Butterfly Garden out in Victoria, BC. And this is a tourist attraction and a butterfly habitat. So most of their costs and most of their emissions come from heating, essentially a giant greenhouse where all these butterflies live. And so they did a couple of really simple things, a boiler retrofit and replaced their greenhouse cover. They had a 16-month payback period, and they cut their emissions by half in 2 years. That's fairly dramatic. That's much more ambitious than you would ever see a government or any sort of level of policymaker aim for. The river market at Westminster Quay, also on the West Coast, this is a sort of farmers market and community music venue and this sort of thing. They took a very different strategy. Most of their emissions were coming from their waste streams, so they engaged with their vendors, optimized their heating, cooling, and air conditioning, and cut their emissions by a quarter in 2 years. The last picture there is of a person named Paul Rack. He's become this incredible sustainability champion very close to where I live in Cambridge, Ontario. Paul Rack runs Veriform, which is a steel fabricator. So this is not a farmer's market with crunchy folks getting their granola. This is a manufacturing company owned and run by Paul and his wife and their crew. So to hear him tell it, he read Al Gore's book like 15 years ago and saw the light and became a convert and realized he needed to make a personal contribution to addressing climate change. He also had a child and was sort of personally motivated that way. And so he and his company implemented over 100 sustainability initiatives, and in the space of 6 years, reduced their emissions by 77% and offset the rest. So they're now a carbon neutral steel fabricator, which is pretty cool. And the average payback period for most of what he did is under 6 months. Some of the payback periods were like weeks, because they were little tweaks that changed behavior inside his company. He's now spun off a consulting and advising business that's, of course, teaching other organizations how to do this. He talks about it all the time. He's having an impact beyond the boundaries of his firm. He did all of this, and he doubled the square footage of his manufacturing facility and increased his staff by 30% during the 2008 to 2009 recession. So he has made his firm more resilient, a larger employer of local folks, and I think is really making a pretty incredible impact. When we look at the diversity of small businesses in the Canadian landscape and elsewhere, and the incredible stuff that they're doing, what really resonates with me is that this is an incredibly diverse group of people compared to sort of their larger firm counterparts. These are owned and operated by people of all genders, by newcomers, by people of color. The diversity amongst the people who have power and control in these firms is wildly different from that in large firms. And that's heartening. So in large firms in Canada, for instance, the largest 100 firms, 30% of those firms don't have a single woman in their executive. And I'm not talking like their CEO isn't a woman, but their CEO, CFO, COO, any of their executive suite, there's not a single woman in a third of those large firms. In contrast, 30% of small and medium-sized enterprises are owned by women. So it's almost the inverse in the small and medium-sized business community. 3% of small and medium-sized enterprises are owned by newcomers to Canada, and that's about the same percentage of newcomers as there are in Canada, so people who have been here for about 5 years or less. That's fairly remarkable, I think. The same is certainly not true of large firms. So there is, I think, a role for small businesses to play in advancing inclusivity and engaging with equity-seeking groups. So to me, this calls to mind the brilliant William Gibson. science fiction writer. As we're thinking about what a sustainable future might look like, he would say the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So, and this can be understood in both a positive and a negative way. There are futures that we don't want to advance, that we don't want to share, already here for lots of people in the world, right? There are also these places, neighborhoods, cities, businesses, where we have a perfect example of a future that we want to bring to fruition more broadly. But what we need is coordination amongst these SMEs, more tailored policy support to engage with them as social, not just economic actors, a broader conversation about the co-benefits, benefits for affordability, for biodiversity, water quality, inclusivity, livability. That's a lot of idiots. But all of these things are part of the sustainability picture. Given this abundance, this becomes a real governance challenge. And, we heard Frank say yesterday that perhaps the role for policymakers and governance actors is to take niche innovations that have already gained some steam and push them over the tipping point. And I think that that's absolutely valuable. SMEs are telling us that they need support from the beginning to actually gain traction and build steam as these niche innovations that have some potential to challenge the incumbents. So I think both might be true. So we find ourselves, I choose to believe, in this place of abundance with this collective desire to accelerate change and more deeply engage with this community. And out of this has grown our new research endeavor, which I'd like to tell you a little bit about before wrapping up. Starting last year, although I was on leave, so starting in January, we've launched a new international research partnership called Transform. This is a global network of researchers and practitioners who work with small and medium-sized enterprises to design sustainability experiments, build capacity, and accelerate innovation in this sector. So this is a really exciting new partnership-based research project that is hitting the ground now. It has an excellent and inspiring team of co-investigators working alongside me at the University of Waterloo. So we have Arnhem Week and George Basile at Arizona State University. We have Megan Farrelly and Wendy Stubbs at Monash. Nikki, yay, at Swinburne University. So we have a vibrant Australian hub. Daniel Lang and Stefan Schultiger at Leuphana. Tess McCormick and Barry Ness at Lund are leading parts of this Transform partnership project. And then, of course, we have an incredible array of collaborators. Some names you'll see are familiar there. And partners in the SME, civil society, and governance community, including our researchers here today, Jose de Bella, Scott Morton-Ninamia, Liliane Camacho, Jennifer Beckett, our research manager, Arvind Kundurpi, and Chris Luderitz, among others. So this is the Transform team, and we're aiming for, world domination and such. This is, et cetera. This has been funded generously by SSHRC and runs for 7 years. So I don't know, roughly until the time when I decide I'm going to be an apple farmer instead or something, change career paths entirely. These are the questions we're asking. What pathways do small and medium-sized enterprises follow as they implement business models and practices that are deeply sustainable? So we're not just interested in those practices, the actual things they do, the product they create or the service they create or how their business runs, but also this underlying business model, their reason for being, who gets to make decisions, how is profit distributed, et cetera. How and why are successful sustainability experiments diffused or scaled up? And how do local spaces support or hinder these transformations in small businesses? So we are locating small businesses in their urban ecosystem to try and understand how interventions within them ripple out through the city. And we're doing this by undertaking these activities. Jose de Bella is leading our first and sort of crucial ground-laying activities of knowledge synthesis, building an interactive database to understand what's already being done and capitalize on all of your excellent work. Build out an interactive capacity building program, so working directly with small businesses to take them to other small businesses so that they can see in person what has worked. They can work within their sector, they can build these collaborations that help them understand what it means to undertake these transformative actions. And then, I don't know why Shirk funded this, but we asked for a fair chunk of money to give to small businesses as seed grants so that they could do new experiments and we could watch them and be with them along the process and support them as they go. So we have funds to foster new experiments, and we hope to see some real change at the other side of this process while analyzing the governance implications and the policy implications throughout. So this is what Transform will be between now and 2025. And it is deeply rooted in transitions thinking and transformation, sociological transformations thinking, as well as environmental governance theory. And ultimately, I view Transform as, this is a bit bizarre and sort of perhaps an unusual note to end on, but I view Transform as a way of studying and actively cultivating hope in this time of great change. And that's the note I'd like to end on. I'd like to make a case for hope rather than optimism. And I'll distinguish between the two based on the work of a really excellent journalist and historian named Rebecca Solnit. If you haven't encountered her, you should. I see nods from like awesome people in the room. You should Google her and read some of her stuff. So Rebecca Solnit describes optimism as this sort of vain, naive belief in the goodness of things. So things will turn out. It'll be fine. Let's just focus on the good stuff. Doesn't matter if I see evidence to the contrary. I'm an optimist no matter what. She might crush me if she heard me describe it that way. Anyway, that is my interpretation of her understanding of optimism. In contrast, hope for her is confronting the reality of things, taking stock of where we actually find ourselves, even in a time of darkness, even in times that are trying, that are challenging. And from there, finding real reasons, real islands of inspiration that do exist, that can sort of point the way forward. And I would encourage all of us to consider the case for hope. I find in this community and others that to be good scholars, we sanitize our work. We create distance between ourselves and what we study. I don't know if that's compartmentalization or personal preservation or whatever. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of latent passion here. And I think engaging with that passion, grappling with the urgency that we feel, with perhaps anxiety, with fear, those are real emotions that are coming up as we're confronting the reality of climate change and other sustainability challenges. But I believe very strongly that the work that everybody here is doing is identifying these islands of inspiration, these reasons for hope, the openings through which we can sort of push ourselves towards a more sustainable future. And she would define then hope as an account of uncertainties and complexities with openings. So if that isn't a description of transition scholarship, like I'm sure, I would imagine she's never read our stuff, this stuff. But this is, to me, absolutely transition thinking put another way. So I'll leave you with that, and thanks very much. Have a great day.